Okay, we pick up with the crash of 1929, and we pick up with some of the visible symbols of, or the crash being the visible symbol of the Great Depression that followed. We'll talk about the handout in class. We had just started to do that. I'll come back to that so we can get a little more detail. One of the things I want to point out is that, as we talked about the other day, people were sending their money to New York in order to buy stock, because it seemed that all you had to do was buy stock and then you would make money. One of the things that was part of that was something called buying on margin, and that was the idea that people bought much of that stock, especially after 1926, by getting a loan in a sense and using that money to buy the stock, and yet expecting to pay off the loan with their future profits. Now, this worked quite well throughout 1928, and from 26 to 28 and even into 29. But as we'll see, there's a point where people begin to understand that the value of the companies is way below the actual price of the stock. And so many people who bought this stock without having the actual money and expected to pay their debts off later were doing something called buying on margin. Even the stockbrokers themselves would take their own money and loan it to their potential clients in order to get them to buy stock, expecting to be paid back later by their future profits. So everybody seemed to jump on this big bandwagon. It's something that later the government will definitely restrict quite a bit when they're trying to keep this from happening again. Well, as we'll talk about in class, the crash does occur, and what happens, as we talked about as we were leaving last time, is that the crash accelerates the downward tumble of consumer demand. And the idea behind that is, once people heard that the stock market was crashing and they understood that banks had loaned money to people that had bought stock and that those banks were beginning to fail, people then stopped buying even if they could and had not bought all that they could. And so it increases the downslide or the negative impact on consumer demand. So people just don't buy things because they're worried about the future. Banks then cut off credit, and in order to try and stay afloat, and of course without credit people can't buy products and businesses can't start up. International trade will slow to a trickle, and as you're probably familiar with, the economic downturn spreads from the United States to Europe and across the world to the different banks that are connected. And there are bank runs across the United States. And again, a bank run occurs when people think there's a risk that their money might be lost. Now, we've talked before about what it is that the government will create to fix that, and that's the FDIC, the idea that people don't usually run on banks too often anymore because they believe that even if the bank closes, their deposits will be protected by the government. But at the time of the crash, this did not exist. Now, the human toll, and I'll read a few more details about this later, but eventually what happens is, as people quit spending their money and people get laid off in massive numbers and people can't pay their rent and get kicked out of their homes, and everything is hit from the most wealthy workers, doctors, lawyers, everybody else, all the way down to the poorest people. By the time this thing hits rock bottom, only 1/4 of those who want work can find it. As I said, it hits all levels of society. Bigotry towards minority increases. Things get pretty mean when things are difficult. Now, the question here is, how did Hoover react? Hoover and the Republicans reacted pretty much the same way that the wealthy and the powerful had always reacted to an economic downturn. There had been a previous massive panic in 1893, but it was short-lived because people believed that it was going to turn around pretty quickly, and it seemed to have. So Hoover responded the way the government had always responded, which by saying things like self-righting forces will prevail, and we need to keep a balanced budget. Now, of course, a balanced budget means not spending on social programs if you don't have the tax money, and as people's incomes dropped, of course, taxes dropped, so they actually had to try and cut spending to keep the budget balanced. Their belief was that if the government budget stayed balanced, then people would believe in it, but of course, that's not enough to convince him that things are going to be good. He also argued that rugged individualism would win the day. In other words, cinch up your belt, stand up straight, work hard, stay quiet, and things will all change. Mellon actually had the guts to make the statement you see here in red, which is he publicly stated that depressions are good for the economy. They weed out bad businesses. And that might be true on a small scale, but when you get something this large, that's not the case. And for the people who were needy, the Republicans looked to charity to take care of them, and this was something that had worked quite well in the past. But again, this is so massive that charity can't keep up with the needs of the people. Hoover will finally act in 1931 as he sees the election of 1932 coming along, but in essence, he was elected to do nothing because that's what the Republican presidents of the 20s and, for that matter, Congress were elected to do, was to not mess with things. And so when they run into this, they decided not to do anything about it in particular because that's what they believed in and that's what they thought the American people had elected them to do. But by 1931, Hoover did finally act, but what he did was too little and too late. He does pass some legislation and begin some programs to try and help people, but although it is sort of a precursor to the New Deal that Roosevelt will do later, the problem is that he waited so long and it was such a small attempt that it has no success. And finally, one final event actually solidifies the American image of Hoover and by extension the Republican Party, and this deals with a group of World War I veterans who had received a bonus when they left the military in 1918 or 1919. And Congress, in its wisdom, had said, we'll give you half of this bonus for having served in the military at this point, and we'll give you the other half in 40 years or somewhere along that line. These men were so broke and had tried everything that they could to get jobs that they couldn't find anything else, that they all met in Washington hoping to convince Congress in 1931 and into 32 to go ahead and give them their bonuses early. So this whole group of former American soldiers, who the press dubbed the Bonus Army, camped out right by, as you can see the picture here on the left, camped out right by Capitol Hill, hoping to convince Congress to vote to give them their bonuses early. And they were called the BEF. The American military in World War I was the American Expeditionary Force, and they were calling these guys the Bonus Expeditionary Force. 15,000 World War I vets. And Congress left and did not vote them anything. In fact, they snuck out of the tunnels that you today can tour underneath the Capitol if you go there. And with this knowledge, the group then decided to march to the White House in order to try and convince Hoover to do something about it. Hoover feared that this group was being run by socialists and maybe communists, so he called out the modern military to run the veterans of World War I out of town. They used tear gas, dogs, rolled in tanks, although they didn't fire at them, but basically just rolled these people out of town with quite a bit of violence taking place. And this image of Hoover running the veterans of World War I out of town with the current army just because they were looking to try and do something to feed their families was one that solidified him as sort of the evil force in the Depression. The Hoover then becomes the image of the Depression. People who have nowhere else to live because they can't pay any rent because they have no jobs will put together shacks and shanties all over America in different towns. And anywhere this was located, they're called Hoovervilles. If you stood somewhere and turned your pants pockets inside out to show how broke you were, it was called waving a Hoover flag. People who had nothing to cover themselves except for newspapers said that they were being covered by Hoover blankets. I had a student a long time ago who had lived through the Depression. This was a student in community college, and she said that when they were kids they called gravy Hoover ice cream because it was all melted. It would be just like melted ice cream. So Hoover becomes the symbol of the Depression, even though, as I argued to you before, it's not really anything he does that makes this happen. The cards were already dealt when he took office. That leads us to the election of 1932, and there's no question that the Democrats are going to have a pretty easy time of it here. In fact, they fight very hard for the nomination with the knowledge that Hoover is so disliked that it's almost a guaranteed win for the Democrat. They choose Franklin Roosevelt, who really doesn't run on a platform of specific legislation to do anything about the Depression. He basically runs on a platform that says, I'm not Hoover, and the Democrats will not only win the presidency with Roosevelt, but they will also take over quite a bit of the seats in the Congress. And interestingly, and this is very typically American, the one issue that the two parties really seemed to fight over in this election was whether or not to legalize alcohol, which the Democrats said they would and the Republicans said they would not. But again, I want you to take a look at this particular map, and you see the states in blue, which are the states that voted for Hoover, and look at the unbelievably massive victory that the Democrats had. And let us flip back now to the election of 1928, just the previous election. And what you see there in green are the places that voted Democrat in 28. So that's a stark comparison or contrast. In fact, it's one of the greatest political turnarounds in history, as Republicans and Hoover are blamed for the Depression. So Roosevelt takes office, and his inaugural address was a very important one. We'll listen to a little bit of it in class. March 4th, 1933. By this point, 38 states have closed their banks so that people won't go and do bank runs. He gives his famous statement that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, which actually says that the reason the economy is the way it is that people don't believe in it. And he's in essence saying that's what we need to change. And in order to do this, he asked for something that if a previous president had asked for this, they probably would have been run out of town, if not perhaps even shot in our early history. He asked for executive authority, in other words, the power for the federal government to behave as if we had been invaded by a foreign nation. And he will use that as the basis for his view that he can use the federal government and create what we call the New Deal. Now, the New Deal is a great number of pieces of legislation and actions by the federal government to try and stem the tide of the Great Depression. Much of the legislation gets passed very, very quickly as Roosevelt gets there in the first 100 days. Federal government programs begin to explode out of Washington at an incredible rate. The specifics. Well, one of the things that was the basis for what these new programs were all about was that they were based on the idea that you would use something called Keynesian economics. And this is a form of economics first described by John Maynard Keynes, an English economist, that said if you can't find anybody else to be the number one customer for your products, make the government your customer. The idea being that the government would buy a bunch of stuff and then kickstart the economy. And once that started and growth began as a result of it, then the government could stop spending, and then the people themselves who were making the money from that would go out and spend it, and then it would grow. Now, this particular form of economics also says that if you need to do so, although you really don't want to, but if you need to, you can spend more than you take in order to kickstart the economy. And we'll see that the government will do that. The problem is that they won't stop the spending. In fact, it's continued to increase pretty much since then. The group of people who come up with these programs are people that Roosevelt brings with him. And one of the things to say about this is that Roosevelt was willing to try all kinds of things. And he brought a lot of people in from academia, from business, and elsewhere, and said, what do you think we can do to turn this economy around? And they created quite a few different programs, but all of these people together are called the Brain Trust. And again, everything being a trust at that period of time. This is the idea of a bunch of smart people that he brought in, and he just said, come up with whatever you can and we'll try it. Well, eventually they create what historians have called the alphabet soup programs, because of all the letters you see there, like the AAA, FDIC, CCC, WPA, and so forth. And the key to all these programs is they were really based on trying to do one of three things, the three R's: relief, recovery, and reform. We'll go into the details of those programs in class. But the key is that Roosevelt was willing to admit failure when it came and move on. Now, one of the things that's important here is that the reason he could do this was that things were so desperate, people would put up with it. A president who tries things and fails now is ridiculed and disliked so much that they probably couldn't do it. But when a crisis exists, the American people are willing to put up with such things. But what these programs really were created to do in many ways was to change the attitude of the American people. In other words, make them think something was going on. And very quickly, within weeks of his inauguration, with all the action that was taking place compared to Hoover really doing not much of anything, even the Republicans